Welcome to the History of North America. I'm Mark Vinette. The Society of Priests of Saint-Sulpice, better known as the Sulpicians, is a society and congregation of Catholic men, named after the Church of Saint-Sulpice in Paris, dedicated to Sulpitius the Pious, a 7th century French bishop and saint. The Sulpicians played a major role in the founding of the city of Montreal, where they engaged in missionary activities, trained priests, and constructed the Saint-Sulpice Seminary, the second oldest structure in the city, constructed during the 1680s and still located in Old Montreal. Let's learn more about their activities in New France with the help of the good folks at Librivox.
The Old Régime in Canada, 1667 to 1668. The quarrel of the disputed bishopric was Sulpician against Jesuit and Montreal against Quebec. Canada, gasping under the Iroquois tomahawk, might, one would suppose, have thought her cup of tribulation full, and, sated with inevitable woe, have sought consolation from the wrath without, in a holy calm within. Not so, however, for while the heathen raged at the door, discord rioted at the hearthstone. Her domestic quarrels were wonderful in number, diversity, and bitterness. There was the standing quarrel of Montreal and Quebec, the quarrels of priests with one another, of priests with the governor, and of the governor with the intendant, besides ceaseless wranglings of rival traders and rival peculators. Some of these disputes were local and of no special significance, while others are very interesting because, on a remote and obscure theatre, they represent, sometimes in striking forms, the contending passions and principles of a most important epoch of history. To begin with one which, even to this day, has left a root of bitterness behind it. The association of pious enthusiasts who had founded Montreal was reduced in 1657 to a remnant of 5 or 6 persons, whose ebbing zeal and overtaxed purses were no longer equal to the devout but arduous enterprise. They begged the priests of the seminary of Saint-Sulpice to take it off their hands. The priests consented, and though the conveyance of the island of Montreal to these its new proprietors did not take effect till some years later, 4 of the Sulpician fathers came out to the colony and took it in charge. Thus far Canada had had no bishop, and the Sulpicians now aspired to give it one from their own brotherhood. Many years before, when the Recollets had a foothold in the colony, they too, or at least some of them, had cherished the hope of giving Canada a bishop of their own. As for the Jesuits, who for nearly 30 years had of themselves constituted the Canadian Church, they had been content thus far to dispense with the bishop, for having no rivals in the field, they had felt no need of episcopal support. The Sulpicians put forward Quailus as their candidate for the new bishopric. The assembly of French clergy approved, and Cardinal Mazarin himself seemed to sanction the nomination. The Jesuits saw that their time of action was come. It was they who had borne the heat and burden of the day, the toils, privations, and martyrdoms, while as yet the Sulpicians had done nothing and endured nothing. If any body of ecclesiastics was to have the nomination of a bishop, it clearly belonged to them, the Jesuits. Their might, too, matched their right. They were strong at court. Mazarin withdrew his assent, and the Jesuits were invited to name a bishop to their liking. Meanwhile the Sulpicians, despairing of the bishopric, had sought their solace elsewhere. Ships bound for Canada had usually sailed from ports within the jurisdiction of the Archbishop of Rouen, and the departing missionaries had received their ecclesiastical powers from him. till he had learned to regard Canada as an outlying section of his diocese. Not unwilling to assert his claims, he now made Quélus his vicar general for all Canada, thus clothing him with episcopal powers and placing him over the heads of the Jesuits. Quélus, in effect, though not in name a bishop, left his companion Suart in the spiritual charge of Montreal, came down to Quebec, announced his new dignity, and assumed the curacy of the parish. The Jesuits received him at first with their usual urbanity, an exercise of self-control rendered more easy by their knowledge that one more potent than Quélus would soon arrive to supplant him. The vicar of the Archbishop of Rouen was a man of many virtues, devoted to good works as he understood them, rich, for the Sulpicians were under no vow of poverty, generous in almsgiving, busy, indefatigable, overflowing with zeal, vivacious in temperament and excitable in temper, impatient of opposition, and as it seems incapable, like his destined rival, of seeing any way of doing good but his own. Though the Jesuits were outwardly courteous, their partisans would not listen to the new curé's sermons, or listened only to find fault, and germs of discord grew vigorously in the parish of Quebec. Prudence was not among the virtues of Quélus. He launched 2 sermons against the Jesuits, in which he likened himself to Christ and then to the Pharisees. Who, he supposed them to say, is this Jesus, so beloved of the people, who comes to cast discredit on us, who for 30 or 40 years have governed church and state here, with no one to dispute us? He denounced such of his hearers as came to pick flaws in his discourse, and told them it would be better for their souls if they lay in bed at home, sick of a good quartan fever. His ire was greatly kindled by a letter of the Jesuit father, in which that father declared that he, Quélus, was waging war on him and his brethren more savagely than the Iroquois. He was as crazy at sight of a Jesuit as a mad dog at sight of water. He cooled, however, on being shown certain papers which proved that his position was neither so strong nor so secure as he had supposed, and that the governor at length persuaded him to retire to Montreal. The Queen Mother, Anne of Austria, always inclined to the Jesuits, had invited Father Lejeune, who was then in France, to make choice of a bishop for Canada. It was not an easy task. No Jesuit was eligible, for the sage policy of Loyola had excluded members of the order from the bishopric. The signs of the times portended trouble for the Canadian Church, and there was need of a bishop who would assert her claims and fight her battles. Such a man could not be made an instrument of the Jesuits. Therefore there was double need that he should be one with them in sympathy and purpose. They made a sagacious choice. Lejeune presented to the Queen Mother the name of François Xavier de Laval Montmorency, Abbé de Montmorency. Laval, for by this name he was thenceforth known, belonged to one of the proudest families of Europe, and churchman as he was, there is much in his career to remind us that in his veins ran the blood of the stern Constable of France, Anne de Montmorency. Nevertheless, his thoughts from childhood had turned towards the Church. All his aspirations were heavenward. He received the tonsure at the age of 9. The Jesuit Bagot confirmed and moulded his youthful predilections, and at a later period he was one of a band of young zealots. He had renounced the world and dwelt at Caen in a house attached to an Ursuline convent known as the Hermitage. Here he lived like a monk in the midst of a community of young priests and devotees. It is there that during 4 years the fervent abbé drank the living and abounding waters of grace, which have since flowed so benignly over this land of Canada. In this celestial abode His ordinary occupations were prayer, mortification, instruction of the poor, and spiritual readings or conference. His recreations were to labour in the hospitals, wait upon the sick and poor, make their beds, dress their wounds, and aid them in their most repulsive needs. In truth, Laval's zeal was boundless, and the exploits of self-humiliation recorded of him were unspeakably revolting. He made journeys on foot about the country, disguised, penniless, begging from door to door, and courting scorn and opprobrium, in order that he might suffer for the love of God. Yet though living at this time in a state of habitual religious exaltation, he was by nature no mere dreamer, and in whatever heights his spirit might wander, his feet were always planted on the solid earth. His flaming zeal had for its servants a hard, practical nature, perfectly fitted for the battle of life, a narrow intellect, a stiff and persistent will, and, as his enemies thought, the love of domination native to his blood.
I'm Mark Vinet, and I hope you're enjoying the ride.